I am Joshua, 29 years old, and on my 18th birthday, my dad threw a $50 bill at me and kicked me out of the house, saying he was done paying for another man's mistake. Before I tell you about how I exposed his darkest secret in front of his entire world, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. There is a specific kind of silence that lives in a house where you are not wanted. It is not a peaceful silence. It is heavy, thick, and suffocating. I grew up inside that silence. It coated the walls of our suburban home, settled into the living room carpets, and echoed down the hallway every single time my father, Robert, walked past me without making eye contact. You learn to walk lightly. You learn to read the microscopic shifts in the atmosphere. You learn to become a ghost in your own home just to survive the sheer hostility of the people who are supposed to be your family. I turned 18 on a Tuesday in late November. I remember the weather was unusually cold for that time of year. The wind was violently rattling the loose window pane in the small, uninsulated room above the garage where I slept. I did not expect a party. I did not expect brightly colored balloons tied to the mailbox, or a stack of wrapped presents on the dining table, or even a cheap greeting card from the local pharmacy. Years of living under Robert's roof had surgically removed any of those normal childhood expectations. But turning 18 is supposed to mean something, right? It is a milestone, a doorway into adulthood. I just wanted a single, quiet moment to acknowledge that I had survived my own childhood. When I got home from my shift washing dishes at the local diner, my clothes smelling deeply of stale cooking grease and bleached dishwater, the house was deathly quiet. My younger brother, Matthew, was sprawled out on the expensive leather sofa in the living room, aggressively mashing the buttons on his video game controller. My grandmother, Margaret, was sitting in her usual floral armchair in the corner. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, and she was staring blankly at the television screen, completely ignoring the violent explosions coming from Matthew's game. Neither of them looked up when the front door clicked shut behind me. Neither of them said a word. I walked into the kitchen, the harsh fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and decided to make my own birthday cake. I used a cheap, generic box mix I had bought with my own meager salary from the diner. 2 eggs, a little vegetable oil, some tap water. I mixed the batter in a scratched metal bowl. The rhythmic scraping of the wooden spoon against the aluminum was the only sound in the kitchen. It felt pathetic, but I was determined to carve out this one tiny sliver of joy for myself. I poured the batter into a dented pan, baked it, and when it finally cooled, I spread a remarkably thin layer of artificial vanilla frosting over the top. I rummaged through the junk drawer next to the refrigerator and found a single half-melted blue candle, a leftover from one of Matthew's extravagant, catered birthday parties years ago. I stuck it right in the center of my lopsided cake and lit it with a wooden match. The small flame flickered, casting long, dancing shadows against the kitchen cabinets. I stood there in the dim light, staring at it. I did not even know what to wish for anymore. I think I just wished for a way out, a way to finally breathe without feeling like I was stealing the oxygen from the room. Then I heard it, the heavy, unmistakable thud of Robert's steel-toed work boots hitting the hardwood floor of the front hallway. He had just gotten home from his construction company. He walked into the kitchen, stopping dead in his tracks when he saw me standing there over the lit candle. Sarah, my stepmother, stopped right behind him. She crossed her arms over her chest, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her arms, her eyes scanning the cheap cake with a look of absolute, undisguised disgust. Robert did not ask what I was doing. He did not ask how my day was. He did not say a single word of greeting. He reached into the back pocket of his faded denim jeans, pulled out his thick leather wallet, and deliberately extracted a single, crumpled $50 bill. He tossed it onto the kitchen island. It fluttered in the air for an agonizing second before landing right next to my cake pan. "Happy 18th, he said. His voice was completely flat, devoid of any emotion, any warmth, any recognition that I was a human being standing in front of him. I looked down at the bill, then slowly up at him. I could feel my heart starting to pound against my ribs, a slow, heavy rhythm of dread building in my chest. I knew a speech was coming. I had seen him rehearsing this exact moment in his cold eyes for years. "Get out," Robert said, his voice dropping an octave, settling into a cold, hard finality that left absolutely no room for negotiation. "Pack your bags tonight. I am done paying for another man's mistake." The words hung in the air, the ultimate insult. He had called me a lot of terrible things over the years, usually behind closed doors or in muttered, drunken breaths, but never with such direct, calculated cruelty. He was throwing me out like a bag of garbage that had been stinking up his pristine kitchen. He wanted to break me. I looked past his shoulder into the living room. Matthew had finally paused his video game. He was standing near the edge of the couch, watching the scene unfold. He was 16, old enough to know exactly what was happening, old enough to say something, to intervene. He just stared, his jaw tight, choosing the absolute safety of silence over defending his own brother. Next to him, Grandma Margaret gripped the armrest of the sofa so hard her knuckles turned white. She looked down at the floor. She did not say a single word. Nobody did. I was entirely alone. I felt a sudden, sharp sting behind my eyes, a tidal wave of betrayal threatening to spill over, but I swallowed it down instantly. My jaw clenched so hard my teeth ached. Crying was exactly what Robert wanted. He wanted me to break. He wanted me to beg. He wanted me to get down on my knees and plead for the pathetic scraps of his conditional shelter. He wanted to feel like a god dispensing punishment. Instead, I reached out with a remarkably steady hand and picked up the $50 bill. I folded it perfectly in half. Then I folded it again, creasing the edges sharply. I slipped it into the front pocket of my jeans. I leaned over and blew out the single candle. A thin ribbon of gray smoke curled up toward the ceiling and vanished into the cold air. "Okay," I said quietly. I turned my back on him, walked up the narrow stairs to my freezing room above the garage, and grabbed a black heavy-duty plastic trash bag. I didn't even own a suitcase. I shoved my few pairs of worn-out jeans, my faded work shirts, a single pair of sneakers, and a framed picture of my mother into the bag. That was it. That was the sum total of my 18 years of existence in that house. I walked back downstairs, the trash bag slung over my shoulder. Robert was still standing in the kitchen, casually leaning against the counter, drinking a beer, watching me leave with a look of smug, victorious satisfaction on his face. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a second glance. I walked straight to the wall phone in the hallway, picked up the receiver, and dialed the only number I knew by heart. My Uncle David answered on the second ring. "Yeah, it's me," I said, my voice eerily steady. "He wants me out." "I'm on my way," David said. He hung up immediately, no questions asked. 40 minutes later, the bright, piercing headlights of David's beat-up blue Ford truck swept across the front living room window. I walked out the front door and stood on the porch. The bitter cold wind bit right through my thin jacket, but I didn't shiver. I stood tall. I looked back at the house one last time, the place where I took my first steps, the place where my mother died, the place that had spent my entire life trying to spit me out. I didn't know then that the real mistake wasn't me. It was him, and I was going to make sure the entire world found out. To fully comprehend the absolute cruelty of that night, you have to understand the woman who used to make that house an actual home. My mother, Elena. When I think of my mother, I do not remember a woman who was weak, even though she spent her entire adult life trying to manage a tyrant. I remember the comforting smell of her vanilla lotion, the soft, reassuring weight of her hand resting lightly on my shoulder, and the incredibly brilliant way she could step between Robert and me without ever making it look like she was protecting me. She was an absolute master at diffusing his sudden, terrifying bouts of rage. If his voice started to rise, if that dangerous vein began to pulse on his forehead, she would suddenly need his help reaching something in the high kitchen cabinets, or she would strategically drop a plate to shatter the tension in the room. She was my shield. She absorbed the blows so I wouldn't have to. But shields cannot stop everything. They certainly cannot stop illness. When I was 12 years old, my mother was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer. The doctors sat us down in a sterile white room and gave her 6 months to live. She fought like an absolute soldier for 14. During that agonizing time, our house stopped being a home and became a miserable waiting room. The sweet smell of her vanilla lotion was entirely replaced by the sharp, stinging scent of bleach and medical-grade antiseptic. The constant, rhythmic beeping of her home medical equipment became the inescapable soundtrack of our lives. And Robert? He was visibly irritated by the sheer inconvenience of her dying. He constantly complained about the mounting hospital bills. He complained about the lack of hot dinners on the table when he got home from work. He complained about the noise of her coughing in the middle of the night. I remember the day of her funeral with terrifying clarity. It rained, one of those miserable, bone-chilling drizzles that seeps right into your soul. Robert wore a tailored black suit and played the part of the grieving, devoted husband absolutely perfectly. He shook hands with the pastor, accepted dozens of casseroles from sympathetic neighbors, and wiped away imaginary tears for the audience. But the moment the guests finally left the house, the moment the front door locked, his mask came off. His eyes went dead. Within 2 months of the funeral, Sarah moved in. She was a woman Robert had known from his various corporate networking events. She brought her own matching sets of expensive luggage, a bitter and highly lucrative divorce from her previous wealthy husband, and an immediate, unexplained, venomous disdain for me. With my mother gone, there was absolutely no one left to run interference. The glaring disparity between me and my younger brother Matthew became impossible to ignore. It was not just simple favoritism. It was an aggressive, deliberate, structural division of our worth as human beings. Matthew was the undisputed golden child. He was the sole heir to the throne. If Matthew so much as sneezed, Robert was ready to pay for a private concierge doctor. If Matthew showed a fleeting interest in playing baseball, Robert went out the next day and bought him a $500 composite bat and a custom-fitted leather glove. Matthew had a massive college fund set up in his name, aggressively funded every single month, before he even reached high school. And then there was me. I was a ghost renting space in the freezing attic above the garage. When I grew out of my clothes, I was flatly told to find a part-time job and buy my own. When the heating vent in my room broke in the dead of winter, sending freezing drafts across my mattress, Robert told me to stop whining and put on a sweater. I started working at the diner when I was 15 just to afford basic necessities like deodorant, toothpaste, and bus fare. I would bike 3 miles in the freezing sleet, scrub baked-on grease-off plates until midnight, and come home to a pitch-black house where the thermostat was physically locked inside a plastic box to keep me from turning up the heat. The most glaring, humiliating example of this division happened on Matthew's 16th birthday. I was out in the front yard, kneeling on the hard concrete, painstakingly pulling weeds out of the driveway cracks. One of the endless, demeaning chores I was assigned to earn my keep. Suddenly, I heard the low, aggressive, unmistakable growl of a high-performance engine turning onto our quiet suburban street. A sleek, immaculate, jet-black Porsche 911 rolled up to our curb, the engine purring like a caged beast. Robert stepped out of the passenger side, beaming with an ugly, arrogant, suffocating pride. He tossed the gleaming silver keys to Matthew, who was standing on the porch, his mouth hanging wide open in pure shock. "Happy sweet 16, buddy," Robert yelled, loud enough for the entire neighborhood to hear. "Only the absolute best for my blood, my blood." He used that phrase constantly. It was his favorite, most frequently deployed weapon. Neighbors actually came out of their houses, walking across their lawns to admire the car. Robert stood there, hands firmly planted on his hips, eagerly soaking in the admiration and envy of the block. He looked over at me, kneeling in the dirt with a rusty trowel in my hands covered in mud. He smirked, cold, victorious smirk. Then he turned his back on me. Later that same week, I had a massive chemistry project due. I was taking advanced placement classes, desperately trying to build a transcript good enough to get academic scholarships so I could finally escape that house. I needed a specific, highly technical textbook that the school library didn't have available. Cost $40 used. I walked into the living room where Robert was watching a football game on his massive, wall-mounted flat-screen TV. "Hey," I said quietly, hating myself for even asking. "I need $40 for a chemistry book. For school. I can pay you back when I get my salary from the diner next week." He didn't even take his eyes off the glowing screen. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his imported beer. "Ask your real father," he said. The words did not sound angry. They sounded completely bored. Like he was stating a simple, irrefutable fact of nature. Like he was pointing out that the sky was blue. I froze. I was 16. I knew he hated me. I knew he resented me. But I didn't fully comprehend the deeply psychotic psychological warfare he was actively waging. He had been dropping vicious hints like this for years, planting toxic little seeds of doubt about my mother's fidelity, about my very existence in his pristine world. I looked over at Matthew, who was sitting on the floor, frantically texting on his brand new iPhone. Matthew paused, his thumbs hovering silently over the glowing screen. He looked up at Robert, then over at me. Then, he looked back down at his phone and kept typing. That was the established dynamic. Robert attacked, Matthew ignored, and I absorbed the impact. The only person in that entire house who seemed to feel any shred of guilt was Grandma Margaret. She came over every Sunday for a forced family dinner. When Robert wasn't looking, she would quickly grab my hand, her frail fingers trembling violently, and press a crumpled $20 bill firmly into my palm. "You're a good boy, Joshua," she would whisper, her voice thick with something that looked a lot like sheer terror. "Don't you ever forget that. You are a good boy." She would look deep into my eyes with such intense, desperate sorrow. I thought she was just feeling sorry for me. I thought she pitied the motherless boy who was treated like a stray dog begging for scraps at the table. I was wrong. She wasn't looking at me with pity. She was looking at me with overwhelming guilt. She knew the truth. She knew the monster her son really was. And her cowardly silence would eventually cost us all. The night I left Robert's house with nothing but a trash bag, my Uncle David didn't ask me what happened. He didn't demand a tearful explanation or a play-by-play of the fight. He just drove me in total silence to his auto repair shop, unlocked the heavy metal side door, and led me up the narrow, creaky wooden stairs to his apartment. He had already cleared out a small storage room in the back. There was a twin mattress directly on the floor, a clean quilted blanket, and a small, battered wooden desk pushed hard against the wall. "You're home now," David said. He wiped his thick, grease-stained hands on a shop rag, nodded exactly once, and closed the door, giving me the first moment of true, unbothered privacy I had experienced in years. David was a man of very few words, but his actions were a titanium fortress. He was 3 years sober when I moved in, carrying his own incredibly heavy past, but he never once made me bear the weight of his demons. He didn't give me motivational speeches or tell me that time heals all wounds. He gave me pure, unfiltered consistency. Breakfast was on the small kitchen table at 6:30 a.m. every single morning. Eggs, toast, black coffee. When I started applying to nursing school, he quietly paid my application fees without making a big deal out of it. When the inevitable rejection letters from the expensive universities came in the mail, he didn't coddle me. He just pointed a greasy finger to the local community college brochure on the counter and said, "We pivot, we don't quit." Under David's sturdy roof, I finally began to breathe. I enrolled in nursing school, working grueling night shifts at the local hospital as an orderly to pay my way. I wanted to get a promotion eventually, to become a registered nurse and make a real salary. I was exhausted, sleeping only 4 hours a day, but I was building a life that was entirely, undeniably my own. Then the sickening rumors started. It was a slow, insidious poison at first. I noticed extended family members acting strange. Cousins would actively avoid my gaze in the aisles of the grocery store, quickly turning their carts around when they saw me. Aunt Rebecca, who used to send me birthday cards, completely stopped replying to my text messages. Even some of the older congregants at the community church Robert attended would look at me with a mixture of profound pity and deep disgust when I passed them on the street. One evening, David came upstairs from the garage early. He looked incredibly angry, a very rare sight for him. The veins in his thick neck were bulging. He tossed his heavy keychain onto the counter with a loud, aggressive clatter. "Your dad is running his mouth," David said. His jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. "About what?" I asked, putting down my heavy medical textbook. "He's telling people that Elena confessed to him right before she died," David said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, gravelly growl. "He's telling the whole damn family that she admitted she had an affair. He's explicitly saying she confessed you weren't his." The kitchen seemed to violently tilt on its axis. My stomach plummeted to the floor. It was one thing for Robert to abuse me in private. It was one thing for him to kick me out onto the street with $50. But to drag my dead mother's spotless name through the mud? To weaponize her tragic deathbed, turning her agonizing final moments into a fake confession just to justify his own cruelty toward me? I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter. My knuckles instantly turned stark white. "That's a lie," I choked out, my chest heaving. "She loved him. She never even looked at another man. You know that, David." "I know it," David said fiercely, slamming his hand on the table. "But he's been planting this toxic seed for years. And since Elena isn't here to defend herself, people are choosing to believe the man who pays for the family vacations and writes the big checks." I couldn't sleep a single second that night. I stared blindly at the ceiling, my chest burning with a rage so profound, so absolute, it terrified me. If I stayed quiet, the lie would calcify. It would become the official family history. My mother would be remembered as a cheap cheat, and Robert would be the martyred saint. The next morning, I skipped my classes. I drove straight to Clara's house. Clara was my mother's best friend, the fiercely loyal woman who had sat by her hospital bed every single day during those grueling 14 months of chemotherapy. When Clara opened her front door and saw my face, her own face crumpled in agony. She pulled me inside immediately and locked the deadbolt. "I heard what he's saying out there," Clara said before I even opened my mouth. She poured me a cup of black coffee, her hands shaking so badly the liquid spilled onto the counter. "It's sick, Joshua. It's completely, utterly sick." "Did she ever say anything to him?" I asked, my voice cracking, needing to hear it out loud from the source. "Did she ever doubt?" "Never," Clara interrupted sharply, slamming her ceramic mug down hard on the wooden table. "Your mother was fiercely loyal. Too loyal. But Joshua, she wasn't stupid." I looked up, confused. "What does that mean?" Clara took a deep, shuddering breath, looking nervously around her own kitchen as if Robert might be hiding in the very cabinets listening to us. "Your mother didn't have a secret, Joshua," Clara said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "But your father did. When she was pregnant with you, she strongly suspected he was stepping out. He was constantly coming home late, smelling like cheap, floral perfume. He was hiding bank statements in his truck. She cried to me about it for weeks, but she was terrified. He explicitly threatened that he would fight for full custody of Matthew if she ever tried to leave, and with his money, she knew he would win. So she buried it." The air violently left my lungs. "If anyone is trying to cover their tracks right now," Clara said, looking me dead in the eye with absolute conviction, "it's him. Science doesn't lie, Joshua. You just need proof." That was the exact moment the overwhelming sadness completely evaporated, replaced instantly by a cold, calculating surgical purpose. I didn't want Robert's love anymore. I didn't want a dime of his money. I wanted his absolute, total destruction. The perfect opportunity presented itself on Thanksgiving. I was in my final grueling year of nursing school. Out of nowhere, Matthew texted me, "Dad is at the country club golf course until 2. Come over, just for a coffee." It was obviously a trap, or at least a test of my desperation, but I didn't care. I drove David's loud truck back to the sprawling house. It looked exactly the same. The perfect lawn, the perfect paint. Matthew let me in through the back door. He looked nervous, shifting his weight constantly from foot to foot. We sat at the massive kitchen island, making painful, stilted small talk about the weather and my clinical rotations. Suddenly, the heavy front door banged open. Robert marched in. He saw me sitting at his kitchen island and his face instantly twisted into an ugly, hateful snarl. "Who let you in?" he barked, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I invited him," Matthew mumbled, staring intensely at the floor tiles. "You don't invite strangers into my house," Robert snapped, slamming his stainless steel travel coffee mug down hard on the granite counter. "Get out. Now." I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice or take the bait. I stood up calmly and put on my heavy winter jacket. As I walked past the counter toward the back door, I reached out in one fluid, practiced motion, grabbed his travel coffee mug by the handle, and slipped it seamlessly into the deep pocket of my coat. Robert was too busy glaring at Matthew to even notice. "Have a good Thanksgiving, Robert," I said. I walked out the door, got into my truck, and immediately pulled out a sterile plastic biohazard bag I had brought from the hospital. I dropped the mug inside and sealed it tight. I just wanted to clear my mother's name. I had absolutely no idea I was about to completely blow up my father's entire life. The agonizing wait for the results was without a doubt the hardest part of the entire process. I took a sterile swab, carefully rubbed it along the rim of Robert's stolen stainless steel coffee mug, sealed it in a vial, took my own DNA sample, and mailed the entire package to an independent, highly certified genomics laboratory in another state. For 3 agonizing weeks, I checked the small metal mailbox outside David's shop every single day, my heart constantly lodged in my throat. When the thick, crisp white envelope finally arrived, it bore a heavy, official, embossed seal on the back flap. I carried it upstairs and sat at the small, battered wooden desk in my room above David's garage. My hands were sweating so profusely I had to wipe them on my jeans twice. I carefully sliced the top of the envelope open with a penknife, terrified of tearing the contents, and pulled out the crisp, legally binding document. I scanned rapidly past the dense scientific jargon, the allele charts, and the genetic markers, my eyes hunting frantically for the absolute bottom line. There it was, printed in bold, unforgiving black ink. Probability of paternity, 99.998%. Conclusion: the tested individual, Robert, is not excluded as the biological father of Joshua. I dropped the paper onto the desk as if it had burned my fingers. I was his son. I had always been his son. Every single insult, every cold stare, every time he casually told me to ask my real father. It was all a fabricated, deeply theatrical lie. He knew I was his. He always knew. I immediately drove to the local library and made a high-quality photocopy of the results. I slid the copy into a new envelope, wrote Robert's name on it in bold block letters, and mailed it directly to his house. I wanted him to see it. I wanted him to open it and know that his sick psychological game was officially up. 2 weeks later, the exact same envelope came back in my mailbox. Scrawled aggressively across the front in thick red Sharpie, in Robert's unmistakable, jagged handwriting, were the words, "Return to sender. Trash." He hadn't even opened it. His psychotic denial was so deeply entrenched, his ego so fragile, that he actively refused to look at empirical scientific evidence. I tossed the returned, defaced envelope into my bottom desk drawer, feeling a bitter, hollow sense of disappointment. He was determined to take his lie to the grave. 6 months later, Grandma Margaret died. Her funeral was a massive, ostentatious affair, entirely paid for by Robert, of course. It was an exercise in public relations rather than grief. I didn't go. I couldn't stomach the sickening thought of standing in the back pew while Robert played the devastated, grieving son, graciously accepting condolences from the very family members he had systematically poisoned against me. A week after she was buried in the family plot, my cell phone rang. The caller ID showed a downtown area code I didn't recognize. "Joshua, this is Patricia Lang," a sharp, highly professional female voice said. "I am a senior attorney at Lang & Rowe. I was your grandmother's estate lawyer. My brow furrowed in confusion. My grandmother didn't have any money. She lived on Social Security. Robert controlled all her finances and her inheritance. This isn't about money or real estate, Patricia said, her tone softening just a fraction. Your grandmother left a very specific item in my custody, with strict, legally notarized instructions that it was to be hand-delivered to you, and only you after her passing. Can you come to my office this afternoon? I drove downtown on my short lunch break from the hospital, still wearing my faded blue nursing scrubs. Patricia's office was incredibly intimidating. Rich mahogany desks, plush leather chairs, and a spectacular, sprawling view of the city skyline. It was a place where powerful people made expensive problems disappear. She sat across from me, her expression carefully unreadable. She unlocked a heavy desk drawer with a small brass key and pulled out a thick manila envelope. The edges were worn from handling, and the flap was sealed with thick, heavy red wax. Margaret came to me 8 months ago, Patricia said quietly, sliding the heavy envelope across the polished wood. She was terrified, Joshua, shaking like a leaf. She told me she had been carrying this specific burden for 30 years, and she couldn't face God without leaving it behind for you to find. I don't know what's inside, but she made me swear on my career and my license that Robert would never, ever touch it. I took the envelope. It felt incredibly heavy in my hands for just a few pieces of paper. I didn't open it in her pristine office. I thanked her, walked back down to the dimly lit underground parking garage, got into the cab of my truck, and firmly locked the doors. The fluorescent lights buzzed aggressively overhead. My hands shook violently as I broke the red wax seal. Inside were 3 pages carefully torn from a cheap spiral notebook, covered entirely in Margaret's cramped, trembling, familiar handwriting. I started reading. By the second paragraph, the breath was knocked completely and violently out of my lungs. Joshua, the letter began. If you are reading this, I am gone, and I am finally standing before the severe judgment I deserve. I am so sorry. I am so terribly, unforgivably sorry. Your mother never betrayed anyone. Elena was an absolute angel on earth. The vicious lie your father tells is to protect himself from the monster he truly is. 30 years ago, in late October, when Elena was 7 months pregnant with you, I drove to your father's new construction site late at night to bring him dinner because he said he was working overtime. His truck was parked behind the equipment trailers in the dark. Caught him, Joshua. I opened the door. I caught my son in the back of his truck with Sarah, the exact woman who is now sleeping in your mother's bed. The words violently blurred as hot tears sprang to my eyes. I wiped them away fiercely with the back of my hand and forced myself to keep reading. Robert panicked. He begged me not to tell Elena. He threatened me. He looked me in the eye and said if I breathed a single word of his affair, he would immediately file for divorce, hire the best lawyers, take Matthew in a brutal custody battle, and leave Elena on the street with absolutely nothing. I was a coward. I chose the safety of my son over the brutal truth. I watched Elena cry herself to sleep for months, suspecting the affair, and I sat there and said nothing. When you were born, you had Sarah's eyes. No, that's not right. You had Robert's eyes, but you looked exactly like the guilt he felt. Every single time he looked at you, he remembered that he was a cheater, a liar, and a fraud. He hated you because you were the living, breathing proof of the absolute worst thing he ever did. He didn't hate you because you weren't his. He hated you because you were his, and he couldn't hide from his own reflection when you were in the room. You were always my beloved grandson. You are Robert's true son. Please, if you can, forgive an old woman who was too afraid to speak when it mattered most. At the bottom was her shaky signature, and right below it, Patricia Lang's official, embossed notary stamp, proving its absolute authenticity. I sat in that dark, freezing truck for an hour, the pages clutched tightly in my hands. The massive, jagged pieces of the puzzle violently snapped together. The cruelty, the isolation, the rumors. Robert was aggressively projecting his own monumental sins onto my dead mother. He had spun a web of lies so thick he almost believed it himself, and he used me as the convenient scapegoat to keep his own reputation completely spotless. The DNA proved I was his son. But the letter? The letter gave me the exact weapon I needed to utterly destroy him. Robert's 60th birthday party was the absolute social event of the year for his pretentious circle. He had rented massive, elegant white tents, set up expensive string lights zigzagging across the sprawling backyard of the house I grew up in, and hired a 12-piece live band. There were at least 80 guests in attendance, extended family members, wealthy business partners, foremen from his construction crews, and high-ranking members of his church congregation. It was a sickening monument to his massive ego. I parked David's truck 2 blocks away, hidden in the shadows of the large oak trees. Uncle David parked his own truck right behind me. He stepped out, leaned heavily against his driver's door, and crossed his muscular arms. "I'm staying right here," David said quietly, his voice a steady anchor in the chaotic night. "If you need me, you know exactly where I am. You ready to do this?" I reached up and touched the inner pocket of my dark jacket, feeling the thick, reassuring bulge of the manila envelope containing both the certified DNA results and Margaret's notarized confession letter. "I've been ready for 11 years, I said. I walked purposefully up the long driveway and let myself through the wrought iron side gate. The lively chatter in the backyard noticeably dipped when people saw me walking in. A few judgmental aunts whispered behind their expensive wine glasses. Matthew saw me instantly, his eyes widening in sheer panic, and he quickly turned and walked in the opposite direction, trying to blend into the crowd. I didn't care. I grabbed a simple glass of water from the catering table and stood near the back edge of the stone patio, waiting in the shadows. At exactly 8 p.m., the band stopped playing. Robert stepped proudly up to a microphone set up near the massive, 3-tiered birthday cake. He looked deeply tanned, incredibly wealthy, and infinitely smug. Sarah stood right beside him, wearing a designer dress that cost more than my first car, smiling perfectly for the admiring crowd. "Thank you all for coming tonight." Robert's voice boomed confidently through the expensive speakers. 60 years. It's a major milestone. You look back at what you've built. The booming business, the pristine reputation, the lasting legacy. He dramatically gestured for Matthew to come up to the microphone. Matthew hesitated visibly, looking pale and nauseous, but he reluctantly walked up and stood awkwardly next to his father. Robert threw a heavy, possessive arm around Matthew's shoulders. "This boy right here, this is my legacy. I've decided today, in front of all of you, that I am officially signing over 50% of the company to Matthew." The crowd erupted into loud, polite applause. Robert held up his hand, soaking it in, waiting for them to quiet down. He leaned closer to the microphone, his tone shifting into something darker. His eyes scanned the crowd, and he found me standing in the back. A nasty, triumphant smile spread across his face. "I'm doing this because family is absolutely everything," Robert continued, his voice dripping with theatrical, sickening sincerity. "And family means blood, real blood, loyalty. Over the years, I've had to carry incredibly heavy burdens. I've had to make peace with the terrible mistakes of others. I stayed quiet about the deep betrayals in my past out of respect for the dead. He was doing it. He was publicly, shamelessly dragging my mother's name through the mud to elevate himself. But at 60, you stop carrying toxic baggage that isn't yours," Robert said, staring right at me with cold, dead eyes. "I only have one son, and he's standing right next to me." The silence in the yard was instantly deafening. 80 people slowly turned their heads to look directly at me. The tension in the air was so thick you could physically choke on it. I set my water glass down on a nearby metal table. The sharp clink of the glass was the only sound in the entire yard. I stepped forward, walking slowly, deliberately, right through the actively parting crowd until I was standing exactly 10 feet from the microphone. "Can I have 60 seconds, Robert?" I asked. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried perfectly in the dead, suffocating quiet. Robert scoffed loudly, leaning aggressively into the mic. You have absolutely nothing to say that anyone here wants to hear, Joshua. You're a guest. Barely. I think they desperately want to hear this, I said. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the thick manila envelope. I pulled out the first document, holding it up high. 7 months ago, I mailed you a certified DNA test. You returned it unopened. So I will read it to you now. Robert's face visibly twitched. That's garbage. Forged. It's from Midstate Genomics, I said clearly, projecting my voice so the very back row could hear every syllable. Case number 884, B. Probability of paternity. 99.998%. You are my biological father, Robert. You always were. Shocked murmurs rippled rapidly through the crowd. People shifted uncomfortably, looking at each other in confusion. Anyone can print a fake piece of paper off the internet, Robert shouted, his face beginning to flush a deep, angry, mottled red. He pointed a thick, trembling finger at me. Get him out of here. He's crazy. I'm not finished, I said, my voice slicing effortlessly through his rising panic. I pulled out the second document, the blue-lined paper covered in Grandma Margaret's handwriting. You told everyone my mother had a filthy affair? I said, my voice trembling not from fear, but from decades of suppressed, boiling rage. You used her tragic deathbed to cover your own tracks. Shut your mouth, Robert roared, taking a threatening step toward me. My cousin Ryan, a guy exactly my age who was built like a professional linebacker, stepped out of the crowd and put his large hand flat on Robert's chest, stopping him dead in his tracks. Let him speak, Uncle Robert, Ryan said grimly. I held up the letter. This is a legally notarized affidavit from your mother, Margaret, written 8 months before she died. Sarah let out a sharp, piercing gasp. Robert froze, all the aggressive color draining from his face in a single instant. The angry red completely vanished, replaced by a sickly, terrifying shade of gray. I read the exact words, loud and clear. I caught my son in the back of his truck with Sarah. Elena was 7 months pregnant with Joshua. Robert begged me to keep his affair quiet. He explicitly threatened to take Matthew away in a brutal custody battle if I told the truth. Elena never cheated. Robert did. A collective, massive gasp echoed across the yard. Someone dropped a ceramic plate, shattering it loudly on the stone patio. I looked directly at Sarah. She was violently shaking, her manicured hands covering her mouth, her eyes darting frantically around the crowd. People she went to church with, people she hosted for expensive dinners, were looking at her with absolute, unadulterated revulsion. You hated me? I said, looking right into Robert's panicked, gray eyes. You didn't hate me because I was another man's mistake. You hated me because every single time you looked at my face, you saw exactly what you did to my mother. I was your mistake, and you made me pay for it for 29 years. Robert opened his mouth, but absolutely no sound came out. The microphone picked up his ragged, heavy, panicked breathing. He looked desperately at the crowd, searching frantically for a friendly face, someone to defend him. He found none. Absolute, devastating, silent judgment stared back at him from 80 pairs of eyes. I walked forward and slapped the DNA test and Margaret's notarized letter flat onto the cake table, right next to his ridiculous birthday cake. You wanted to know who my real father is? I said, my voice low but carrying absolute finality. I turned and pointed firmly toward the open wrought iron gate, out to the dark street. Under the glowing street lamp, Uncle David was standing by his truck, arms crossed, watching the entire thing. DNA says you're my father, I said, staring a hole right through Robert. But the man standing out there? He's my dad. I turned my back on him. I didn't wait for a pathetic response. I walked through the crowd. They parted for me like I was Moses parting the sea. I walked out the gate, got into David's truck, and we drove away, leaving Robert's entire fake kingdom burning to the ground behind us. De la Cohen kak they doi tat ca, kai tua koi kung de lay lai duak win kim so kuak doi min. Cam on ban de kien and kung toi den day. Ban that tuet voi. Hey jup toi like video va ben luan so one ben dui. De toi beat ban de dong han kung toi toi day. Du nai kong chi jup nu nuoi han tim thay ka chuyen nai. Ma kan cho toi beat rang and hung tre niam qua toi ko wai nia voi ai du. Suung ho qua ben la dong luk lan not de toi tip tu si chia se and hung fan kan lai qua han trin nai. The fallout from the explosive birthday party was not a loud, sudden explosion. It was a slow, agonizing, irreversible demolition. A man exactly like Robert survives purely on his pristine reputation. He relies entirely on people believing he is an honorable, God-fearing pillar of the community, a self-made man who does no wrong. Once that fragile illusion was violently shattered in front of 80 witnesses, the stark reality of who he actually was became impossible for anyone to ignore. The severe consequences started rolling in bright and early on Monday morning. Aaron, a senior foreman who had loyally worked for Robert's construction company for over 15 years, walked straight into the main office and threw his yellow hard hat onto Robert's expensive mahogany desk. Aaron had known my mother well. He had attended her funeral and cried. "I'm out," Aaron told him flatly. "I heard this directly from a cousin who worked in the accounting billing department and saw the whole thing happen. I cannot and will not work for a man who viciously smears his dead wife to hide his own dirt and throws his own flesh and blood kid away like garbage. You make me physically sick, Robert." Aaron didn't just quit that day. He took two of the absolute best, most experienced master carpenters with him to a rival firm. Within a single week, Robert lost a massive, multimillion-dollar commercial contract because the city developers heard about the sudden walkout and officially cited staffing instability and character concerns. In a tight-knit town like ours, gossip moves faster than a wildfire, but the undeniable truth? The truth burns so much hotter. By the following Sunday, the consequences rapidly reached his precious, carefully cultivated social standing. Robert had been a highly visible deacon at the Grace Hill Community Church for over a decade. He absolutely loved standing in the grand lobby in his expensive tailored suits, shaking hands and loudly taking credit for the church's annual charity drives. But that specific Sunday, his name was quietly, permanently removed from the printed bulletin. A kind woman named Linda stepped up to the wooden pulpit to read the morning scripture instead. There was no public excommunication, no dramatic town hall meeting, just a cold, decisive, community-wide shunning. The head pastor had called him on Friday afternoon and strongly suggested he take an indefinite leave of absence from all leadership roles. Even the neighbors turned on him. Mrs. Henderson, a sweet, elderly woman who had lived right next door to us since before I was even born, actually drove all the way across town to Uncle David's grimy auto shop. She walked in holding a floral tin of freshly baked chocolate chip cookies, looking utterly, profoundly ashamed. "These are for Joshua," she told David, her voice trembling with emotion. Elena was the absolute kindest woman on our street. We all heard the terrible rumors Robert constantly spread. We should have known better. We should have seen through him. We should have said something years ago to protect that boy. David quietly put the tin on the counter in our apartment that night. I ate a cookie in total silence. Tasted exactly like closure. Kindness hits very differently when it arrives over a decade late, but it still meant the absolute world to me to finally know my mother's name had been completely scrubbed clean in the eyes of the people who mattered. For 2 entire, agonizing weeks, Robert did not leave his house. He didn't go to the active job sites. He didn't go to the country club golf course. He just sat inside the sprawling, empty suburban home he had built, completely and utterly isolated. Sarah, according to rapid family whispers, had frantically packed 2 massive designer suitcases the morning after the party and gone to stay indefinitely with her sister in another state. She simply couldn't handle the dirty, disgusted looks she got at the local grocery store. Robert was completely alone, and for a raging narcissist who thrived heavily on control and public admiration, that crushing isolation was a punishment far worse than any courtroom judge could have ever handed down. About a month after the party, I walked out to check the small metal mailbox outside David's apartment. Inside was a thick, high-quality, expensive envelope. My name was written clearly on it in Robert's blocky, aggressive handwriting. I took it upstairs and threw it onto the kitchen counter. I stared at it for 3 full days before I finally found the energy to open it. I pulled out a single sheet of typed paper. I read it slowly, carefully searching the paragraphs for one very specific word. Joshua. Things at the party got completely out of hand. Tempers flared, and things were said that didn't need to be aired in public. I have made mistakes in my life. We all do. The extreme pressure of providing a massive salary for a family causes men to make difficult, regrettable choices. The house is still your home if you want it to be. The door is open. Come back over so we can talk this out like men and put this ugly business behind us. Dad. I read it twice. The word I was frantically looking for wasn't there. Sorry. There was no apology. There was no acknowledgement of the monstrous, life-ruining lie he had forced me to live under. There was no ownership of the fact that he had cheated on a dying woman and cowardly blamed her for it. He casually called his massive betrayal difficult choices. He called 30 years of severe psychological abuse mistakes. He honestly thought he could just wave his hand, offer me a seat at his now empty table, and I would come running back, pathetic and grateful for the scraps of his attention. He still didn't understand a thing. He never would. I didn't tear the letter up. I didn't burn it in dramatic fashion. I carefully folded it back into its exact original creases. I walked into my bedroom, opened the bottom drawer of my wooden desk, and placed it right next to the unopened DNA envelope he had returned to me months ago. I closed the drawer with a solid, satisfying click. I walked back out to the kitchen, where Uncle David was drinking a hot cup of black coffee. He looked up at me, raising a thick eyebrow. "You good with whatever was printed in that letter?" David asked, his voice rough. "I'm done," I said, and for the absolute first time in 29 years, the words didn't taste like defeat. They tasted like absolute, pure freedom. He's officially in the past now. It had been exactly 34 days since the disastrous birthday party that shattered Robert's carefully constructed world. I had settled back into my routine. I was working my grueling nursing shifts at the hospital, picking up extra hours and saving my salary. The suffocating weight that had pressed down on my chest for 29 years was finally gone. I was sleeping through the night for the first time in my life. I thought I had completely severed every single tie to that massive, toxic house on Maple Drive. I thought my past was officially a closed book. Then, late on a rainy Thursday afternoon, I heard a heavy, hesitant knock on my apartment door. Uncle David was downstairs in the auto shop working on a transmission, so I was alone in the apartment. I walked over to the door, expecting a delivery driver or maybe a neighbor complaining about a parked car. I unbolted the lock and pulled the door open. Standing in the dimly lit hallway, dripping wet from the relentless rain, was my younger brother, Matthew. I froze. The absolute last person I ever expected to see standing on my worn welcome mat was the golden child, the heir to the throne. Matthew looked terrible. The arrogant, untouchable smirk he used to wear like a second skin was completely gone. He looked exhausted. There were deep, dark purple circles under his eyes, and his expensive designer jacket was soaked through, clinging heavily to his shoulders. He looked like a man who had not slept a full hour in a month. We stood there in total silence for a long, uncomfortable moment. The only sound was the heavy rain drumming aggressively against the hallway window. My first instinct was to slam the door right in his face. This was the same brother who had watched Robert throw me out into the freezing cold with a $50 bill and said absolutely nothing. This was the brother who had passively accepted every single unearned privilege, every expensive car, every fully funded college fund, while I washed greasy dishes until my hands bled just to buy a used chemistry textbook. "What do you want, Matthew?" I asked. My voice was completely flat, devoid of any warmth or welcome. I did not step aside to let him in. Matthew swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed in his throat. He looked down at his expensive leather shoes, then back up at me. His eyes were bloodshot. I know I have absolutely no right to be here, Joshua, Matthew said, his voice cracking slightly. I know you probably want to punch me in the jaw, and honestly, I wouldn't even try to stop you if you did. But I need to talk to you. Please, just give me 5 minutes. I stared at him. He wasn't demanding anything. He wasn't acting like the entitled prince of the house. He looked entirely broken. I slowly stepped back and pulled the door open wider. 5 minutes, I said coldly. Come in. Matthew walked into the small, cramped apartment. He looked around at the cheap thrift store furniture, the water stains on the ceiling, the tiny kitchen area. It was a massive downgrade from the sprawling, meticulously decorated suburban mansion he was used to, but he didn't sneer. He just stood awkwardly in the center of the living room, looking completely lost. He reached a shaking hand into the inner pocket of his wet jacket and pulled out a small, slightly crumpled piece of glossy paper. He held it out to me. I didn't take it right away. I looked at his hand, then at his face. What is that? Jenny is pregnant, Matthew said quietly. His wife, Jenny, was a quiet, kind woman who always seemed incredibly uncomfortable around Robert's abrasive personality. She's 20 weeks along. We just had the anatomy scan yesterday. It's a girl. We are having a daughter. I slowly reached out and took the glossy paper. It was a grainy, black and white ultrasound photo. I could clearly see the curved spine, the tiny, perfectly formed head, the faint outline of a tiny hand floating in the static. A strange, sharp ache hit the back of my throat. A new life, a completely innocent blank slate entering our deeply fractured bloodline. Congratulations, I said, handing the photo back to him. I meant it, but I still kept my emotional walls firmly reinforced. Does Robert know? Matthew let out a harsh, bitter laugh that sounded more like a cough. He shoved the photo safely back into his pocket. Robert doesn't know anything, Matthew said, his voice hardening with a sudden, fierce resentment. I haven't spoken a single word to him since the night of the party. I haven't answered his calls. I haven't gone to the office. I packed up my desk at the construction company 2 weeks ago and left my office keys on his expensive desk. I am completely done with him. That shocked me. The golden child walking away from the empire? That was completely unheard of. What about your massive inheritance? I asked, my tone sharp, probing for the catch. What about the 50% of the company he just publicly promised you on a microphone? You're just walking away from millions of dollars. Matthew looked me dead in the eye, and for the very first time in my entire life, I saw genuine, unadulterated shame radiating from him. I knew Joshua, Matthew said, his voice dropping to a harsh, agonizing whisper. I always knew he was lying. I was 12 years old when Mom died. I wasn't stupid. I saw the way he looked at you. I heard the cruel, disgusting things he muttered under his breath when you walked out of a room. I knew Mom never cheated on him. I knew he was the one sneaking out, hiding things, acting guilty. I knew he was emotionally destroying you. He took a shaky breath, running a hand through his wet hair. But I was a coward, Matthew confessed, the words pouring out of him like a dam breaking. I was a selfish, pathetic coward. He made it so incredibly easy for me to just look the other way. He bought me that ridiculous Porsche. He paid for my entire university education without me ever having to take out a single student loan. He promised me a high-salary executive position. He promised me the entire kingdom. All I had to do was agree with him. All I had to do was pretend you were the villain, and I got to live like a king. I traded my own brother for a comfortable life. I stood perfectly still. The sheer validation of hearing him finally admit it out loud was staggering. For 29 years, I had been the designated crazy person. I had been the problem child. And now, the favorite son was standing in my cheap apartment, stripping away his own armor and admitting his complicity. Why are you telling me this now? I asked, my voice much softer than before. Why today? Matthew reached back into his pocket and touched the ultrasound photo. Because of her, Matthew said, his eyes shining with unshed tears. When I saw my daughter on that monitor yesterday, When I saw her tiny heart beating on that screen, something inside me completely snapped. I looked at Jenny, and I realized with absolute horror that I am about to become a father. And I asked myself what kind of father I am going to be. He took a step closer to me, his expression desperate. If I stay in that company, Joshua, if I take his dirty money, if I accept that inheritance, I am endorsing exactly who he is. I am validating every single terrible thing he did to you and to our mother. I am allowing that toxic, abusive, narcissistic poison to pass right down to my little girl. And I refuse to do it. I will not raise my daughter in the shadow of a man who destroyed his own family just to protect his fragile ego. I won't let her ever think that conditional, abusive control is what love looks like. He stopped, his chest heaving, wiping a tear from his cheek with the back of his hand. I am so sorry, Joshua, Matthew whispered. It was the absolute first time he had ever apologized to me. I am so incredibly sorry that I let you take all the hits. I should have stood up for you. I should have told him to go to hell the night he threw you out. I can never, ever fix the past. I know that, but I am begging you to let me try to be a brother to you now. I looked at Matthew, really looked at him. I saw a man who had finally woken up from a very long, very comfortable nightmare. Generational trauma is a vicious, ugly beast. It thrives in the dark. It survives on silence and compliance. It gets passed down from father to son like a cursed heirloom until someone finally has the courage to stand up and say, "This stops right here." Matthew had just made that choice. He was giving up an absolute fortune to save his own soul. I felt the heavy, fortified walls I had built around my heart slowly begin to lower. I walked over to my small kitchen counter, grabbed 2 clean coffee mugs, and turned back to him. "Have you picked out a name for her yet?" I asked quietly. Matthew let out a long, shuddering breath, a massive wave of relief washing over his face. He nodded vigorously. "Marina," he said, a small, genuine smile breaking through his exhaustion. "We are going to name her Marina." "That's a beautiful name," I said. "Sit down, Matthew. Let's have some coffee." That rainy afternoon changed the entire trajectory of our family. We didn't fix 29 years of damage in a single conversation, but we laid the foundation. For months later, my phone rang at 3 in the morning. It was Matthew. His voice was frantic, wildly excited, and breathless. Jenny's water had broken. I threw on my clothes and drove straight to the hospital. I wasn't on shift, but I practically sprinted through the familiar brightly lit corridors until I reached the maternity ward waiting room. When I pushed through the heavy double doors, I stopped in my tracks. The waiting room was full, but not with strangers. Uncle David was sitting in a corner chair, reading a worn paperback novel, his reading glasses perched on his nose. Clara, my mother's fiercely loyal best friend, was pacing the floor holding a massive bouquet of bright yellow sunflowers. Aunt Rebecca, who had finally reached out to me crying a week after the birthday party to beg for forgiveness, was sitting on a sofa meticulously crocheting a soft pink baby blanket. This was my family. Not the people tied together by legal obligation or forced proximity, but the people who actively chose to show up. A few hours later, the heavy wooden doors of the delivery ward swung open. Matthew walked out wearing blue hospital scrubs. His hair was a wild mess, his eyes were incredibly red, and he was grinning so hard I thought his face might actually split in half. He looked around the room, taking in all the faces. Then he looked directly at me. He walked straight over and pulled me into a massive, crushing hug. "She's here," Matthew whispered into my shoulder, his voice thick with overwhelming emotion. "She's perfect, Joshua. She's absolutely perfect." 10 minutes later, I was allowed into the quiet, dimly lit recovery room. Jenny was lying in the hospital bed, looking incredibly exhausted but radiating absolute, pure joy. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in a striped hospital blanket. Matthew gently took the baby from Jenny and walked over to me. "You want to hold your niece?" he asked softly. I carefully held out my arms. Matthew placed little Marina into them. She weighed barely 7 pounds. She had a full head of dark hair, exactly like mine, exactly like my mother's. She opened her tiny, dark eyes and blinked up at the bright ceiling lights. I looked down at her, feeling a profound, overwhelming surge of fierce protectiveness. She was so incredibly small, so completely innocent. She would never know the cold, terrifying silence of the house on Maple Drive. She would never know the biting cruelty of Robert's conditional love. She would never have to earn her right to exist. I looked up at Matthew. He was standing beside the hospital bed, watching me hold his daughter. The look on his face was one of absolute peace. He had successfully rewritten the future. "She's beautiful, Matthew," I whispered, my vision blurring with happy tears. We had survived the storm. The toxic cycle was officially broken. A completely new dawn had finally arrived. The following month, I finally turned 30. It felt drastically different than my 18th birthday. I was no longer a terrified, hollowed-out kid bracing for the next brutal impact. I was a grown man. I was a highly respected registered nurse, earning a solid salary that easily paid my bills. I had my own life, completely free from the suffocating shadow of the man who had tried to erase my existence. I decided to bake a cake again. But this time, I was not standing in a hostile, freezing kitchen waiting to be screamed at. I was standing in the warm, incredibly messy kitchen of Uncle David's apartment above the auto shop. I didn't use a cheap, generic box mix this time. I bought real, high-quality ingredients. Pure vanilla extract, heavy cream, rich dark chocolate, expensive butter. I took my time measuring the flour, cracking the eggs, whisking the batter until it was perfectly smooth. The rich, sweet smell of baking chocolate filled the entire apartment, completely covering the faint, permanent smell of motor oil that always lingered in David's clothes. David was sitting at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of black coffee, watching me work with a quiet, satisfied smile on his weathered face. He had officially legally adopted me 2 weeks prior. It was purely symbolic at my age, but it meant the absolute world to both of us. The judge had slammed the gavel down, and my last name was officially changed. I was no longer Joshua Calloway. I was Joshua Ruiz. I finally carried the name of the man who had actually raised me. When the cake was done and frosted with thick chocolate ganache, I didn't bother with candles. David and I just cut 2 massive slices, sat at the table, and ate in comfortable, easy silence. While I was eating, my eyes drifted over to the living room wall. Hanging right next to the front door, prominently displayed where I would see it every single time I left the apartment, was a small, cheap, black plastic frame I had bought from a local dollar store. Inside the frame, perfectly preserved and pressed flat against the glass, was a single, slightly crumpled $50 bill. People who visit the apartment always ask me about it. They assume it is my first tip from the diner or a lucky bill I found on the street. I never tell them the full story. It is too heavy for casual conversation. I do not keep that $50 bill on my wall out of anger. I do not keep it out of some dark, lingering desire for revenge. Anger is an incredibly heavy, toxic burden to carry, and I simply refuse to let Robert take up another square inch of real estate in my mind. I keep it as a receipt. I keep it as a permanent, physical reminder of exactly what Robert valued me at. $50. That was the pathetic price tag he aggressively slapped onto 18 years of my life. $50 for 4 missed birthdays. $50 for forcing me to sleep in a freezing room. $50 for publicly calling me a mistake. $50 for viciously smearing the pristine name of the woman who loved him. He honestly thought throwing that bill at my chest was the ultimate insult. He thought it was a dismissal that would completely break me. Instead, it became my absolute liberation. It became the exact moment I realized that I was completely, utterly free from his impossible, cruel expectations. Blood does not automatically earn trust. DNA does not automatically grant you the title of a father. Behavior does. Actions do. Showing up, day after day, in the hard moments, is what builds a family. Sometimes I wonder where Robert is now. I hear things occasionally through the family grapevine, though I never actively ask. After the disastrous birthday party, his life rapidly unraveled. Without the highly lucrative commercial contracts, his construction company began severely bleeding money. Sarah, terrified of losing her luxurious lifestyle, quickly filed for a highly contentious, incredibly messy divorce. She hired a team of ruthless corporate lawyers who aggressively picked apart his assets, taking half of everything he had built. He was forced to sell the massive house on Maple Drive just to pay his mounting legal fees and cover his sinking business debts. He lives alone now in a small, rented condominium on the outskirts of town. He has no company. He has no prestige. He has no loving family coming over for Sunday dinners. He is entirely isolated in a prison built entirely by his own colossal ego. He wanted total control and he got it. Now he controls absolutely nothing but his own empty rooms. My mother, Elena, unfortunately ran out of time before she could adequately defend herself against his lies. But the absolute truth, no matter how deeply it is buried, always eventually finds its way to the surface. It just needs a dedicated champion. Grandma Margaret knew the horrifying truth for 3 long decades. She was paralyzed by fear, terrified of breaking the comfortable illusion of her family, and her silence ultimately caused immeasurable pain. But in the absolute final moments of her life, she finally found her courage. She left me the ultimate key to my freedom, and for that I have officially forgiven her. Matthew loved me deep down, but he was heavily conditioned to prioritize his own comfortable survival. He didn't find his true voice until the very foundation of the house was completely cracking. But when it mattered most, when his own daughter's future was on the line, he made the incredibly hard, painful choice to walk away from the money and break the cycle. He is an amazing, deeply involved father to Marina now. And then there is Uncle David. David had absolutely no legal obligation to me. He shared 0 DNA with me. He didn't know me a single thing. He just had a spare room, a big heart, and a decision to make. Show up or don't. He chose to show up every single morning at 6:30 a.m. He showed up for every hard nursing exam, every quiet breakdown I pretended wasn't happening, every moment I doubted my own worth. The DNA test results didn't magically set me free. Choosing to finally stop defending myself to a man who was absolutely, fundamentally committed to misunderstanding me. That is what actually set me free. Setting a firm boundary is not an act of revenge. It is an act of clarity. It is an act of extreme self-love. If you are listening to this right now, and you have someone in your life, a parent, a sibling, a partner, who continuously forces you to audition for their love, who constantly rewrites your worth based on their own selfish moods, hear this loud and clear. You are not required to tolerate abuse just because you share the same bloodline. You are not obligated to stay in a room where your very existence is fiercely debated or treated as a burden. You have the absolute right to pack your bags, walk out the door, and build your own table with people who actually want to sit with you. My name is Joshua Ruiz. I am an incredibly proud nurse. I am a deeply devoted uncle. I am a loyal brother. I am a grateful son to the man who actually raised me. And I am finally, unequivocally, exactly where I am supposed to be. If there is one profound, life-changing lesson I want you to take away from my entire journey, it is this. You possess the absolute power to break the cycle of generational trauma. You do not have to inherit the toxic behavior, the cruel secrets, or the heavy, suffocating silence of the people who raised you. Family is not a permanent, unbreakable contract signed at birth in blood. Family is a daily, active choice. It is a conscious decision to treat the people in your life with unwavering respect, honesty, and unconditional support. When you finally realize that setting a strict boundary to protect your own mental health is not an act of betrayal, but an act of essential self-preservation, your entire life will dramatically change. Do not ever allow anyone, no matter what their title is, to make you feel like you are a mistake. Your worth is completely inherent. It is not determined by the deeply flawed opinions of broken people. Walk away from the tables where respect is no longer being served. I would love to hear your thoughts on this. What is the most important lesson you took away from my story? How have you handled setting boundaries with difficult family members in your own life? Please share your experiences in the comments below, or simply drop the word good in the comments so I know that these lessons resonated with you and that my story brought you some genuine value today. Thank you so much for listening.